Imagine, if you will, a world that is more than what your eyes can see, a world behind the world, so to speak, where battles are fought in silence, victories won without applause, and protection is offered with no expectation of thanks. It is in this invisible realm that God's angels move. You do not see them, and perhaps that is the point. If you saw them, if every act of divine protection came with thunder and flashing lights, we would be overwhelmed. Or worse, we might begin to rely on spectacle rather than faith. There is something profoundly humbling about the way God chooses to work through his angels. Not with trumpets or flashing signs, not with the loud fanfare our human minds so often crave, but with quiet precision and holy restraint. They work invisibly, not because they lack power, but because their purpose is not to be seen, it is to serve. They carry out the will of the Creator with a discipline that is both beautiful and mysterious, and their invisibility is part of the gift. In our world, we tend to measure help by how visible it is. We trust what we can see, count, or explain. But the work of angels is rarely like that. It is more like the turning of the tide. Seasonal. You're still enough to observe. Wait, it's enough to observe. Most of the time, we're too distracted to realize what we've been spared. A sudden change of plans, an uneasy feeling that made us pause, a strange sense of peace when we should have been afraid. These things come and go, and we often credit coincidence or instinct. But what if those were not accidents at all? What if those moments were the soft footprints of angels moving just beyond our line of sight? We live in a story so much larger than we understand. The physical world we see and touch is only part of the reality God has made. There is a spiritual realm, vast, active, full of movement and meaning, that we are mostly unaware of. In this realm, angels move like wind, unseen but present. They are not bound by the limitations we are. They do not need sleep, nor do they hesitate. They do not need applause, for their loyalty is not to ego, but to glory. Their work is often preventative, which makes it hard to recognize. We are good at noticing disasters, but how often do we stop to wonder how many were averted? A falling tree that didn't fall where we stood. A car that paused just long enough for us to pass. A storm that changed direction. A sickness caught early. These are things we rarely pause to appreciate, yet they may well be the very evidence of angelic intervention. Not dramatic, not loud, but deliberate and filled with purpose. And still, they do not appear to us demanding recognition. They are content to remain invisible because their aim is not to impress us, but to protect us. Their obedience to God is complete, and in that obedience, they find joy. Define joy. It is the kind of service we struggle to understand because it is done without seeking reward. In a world that thrives on being seen, praised, and validated, the angels quietly do their work in the shadows, answering only to the light. There is something sacred about that kind of humility. It reflects the heart of heaven itself, where greatness is not about being noticed, but about being faithful. Perhaps this is why we are not meant to see them often, because the point is not that we notice them, but that we trust the one who sends them. To live by faith means, in part, to believe that God is working, even when we cannot see how, even when the protection is invisible, even when the angel passes by, and we never knew they were there. So yes, angels work invisibly. And in doing so, they remind us of something deeply important, that what is unseen is not unreal, that God's care for us goes beyond the limits of our perception, and that sometimes the greatest miracles are the ones we never even knew we needed. There's something quietly profound in the idea that many of the greatest protections we receive in life are never known to us. They pass through us like wind through trees, shaping the course of our lives without ever announcing their presence. This is in many ways the way of God's protection, especially the kind delivered through his angels. They do not wait for our recognition or applause. Their work is not diminished by our ignorance of it. Rather, they continue, steadfast and tireless, standing between us and dangers we never saw coming. We are trained by experience to notice only what touches us directly. A storm that passes us by is just part of the weather. A delay in our plans is an annoyance. A closed door is a disappointment. But what if these things were not just accidents of time or chance? What if they were acts of mercy disguised as inconvenience? We might never know the answer fully in this life, but it is not unreasonable to believe that many of these interruptions are divine detours, reroutings guided by a wisdom far beyond our own. We may think back to times we were late for something and found ourselves frustrated, only to hear later of a crash on the road we would have taken, or danger in a place we almost entered. These events often register in our minds as curious coincidences, shrugged off with a grateful nod to chance. But what if that delay was the soft hand of an angel holding us back just enough to save us from harm? What if we were spared a pain we never had to feel, a loss we never had to grieve? It is the very nature of such protection to be uncelebrated. You cannot thank someone for a wound you never received. You cannot express gratitude for a sorrow that never reached you. And yet, it is precisely this kind of invisible guardianship that speaks most deeply of God's care for His children. It is a quiet love, a protecting presence that does not need to be noticed to be real. In fact, its hiddenness may be its most powerful quality. We often think of miracles as large and dramatic, healings, visions, supernatural signs. But perhaps the more common miracles are the ones hidden in the ordinary moments. The wrong turn that became the right one, the job we didn't get that freed us from unseen burdens, the relationship that ended before it could bring more pain. It is a mercy we rarely understand at the time, because we are so focused on what was taken from us that we fail to see what we were saved from. This kind of protection requires trust, a kind of spiritual maturity that accepts not knowing all the reasons. It is difficult, of course, to thank God for what didn't happen, to praise Him for the accidents that never came, the illnesses that never grew, the evil that never touched us. But these things are real. Just because we cannot measure them does not mean they are imaginary. A child does not know how often a parent keeps danger away. They do not see the outlet covered, the food tested, the edge blocked, yet they are safe because of it. In the same way, we walk through our days under a shield we did not fashion, watched over by eyes we cannot see. And what grace, what kindness that God has appointed these messengers, these angels, not to stand back and wait for our requests, but to go before us, beside us, and behind us. Their task is not just reactive, but proactive. They are not just sent when we pray, but often long before. They guard the roads we never take, the temptations we never fall into, the accidents we narrowly miss. Their protection is as constant as it is quiet. We might go our whole lives never knowing the full extent of what we've been saved from. But one day, perhaps, we'll see it clearly. Perhaps in the presence of God, when all things are revealed, we will see the outlines of dangers we never knew existed, and behind each one, the quiet shadow of an angel who turned it away. Until then, we live in trust. Trust that just because we cannot see the danger doesn't mean we are without defense. Trust that even in silence, we are being cared for. And trust that often the greatest signs of love are not the ones we notice, but the ones that quietly keep us safe, again and again, without ever needing to be seen. We live in a world that craves signs, loud, unmistakable signs. We want to be shown, proven, convinced. We long for clear answers, for help that arrives with flashing lights and dramatic timing. But divine help, more often than not, comes in gentler ways. It is not always loud. It is not always obvious. In fact, it is most often subtle, like a whisper in a noisy room or a feather landing quietly in your hand. You might miss it if you're not paying attention, and perhaps that's intentional. God rarely forces Himself into our view. He does not overwhelm us with His power to prove His presence. He lets us choose belief, gives us the space to respond with faith rather than fear. And so His help comes to us with a kind of holy restraint. It slips into our lives through moments we might otherwise overlook. A sudden peace in the middle of chaos. A friend calling at just the right time. A small door opening when all others seem shut. These are not always the kinds of things we'd write into a grand story, but they are real and they matter. There is a divine elegance in subtlety. It means that God does not help us because He needs us to notice, but because He loves us. His assistance does not come with a signature or a demand to be acknowledged. It is given freely without condition, like rain falling on dry ground. And His angels, His messengers, are reflections of this same quiet grace. They do not arrive to impress. They arrive to intervene. This kind of subtle help requires something of us. It asks us to look differently at our lives, to learn to see not just what is loud or visible, but to notice what is steady and small. The help of God may not always feel like a dramatic rescue. It may feel like endurance or clarity, or the strength to take just one more step when we thought we couldn't. It may come in the form of a delay, or a change of heart, or even a sudden pause that keeps us from speaking words we would later regret. None of it seems miraculous in the moment, yet it shapes everything. Part of the challenge is that we are often looking for the kind of help that feels like escape. We want to be lifted out of our trouble, not led through it. We want the sea to part, the mountain to move, the enemy to vanish. But sometimes divine help is not the removal of the difficulty, but the quiet grace to endure it without losing hope. The whisper that says, keep going, you're not alone. That's not a spectacle, but it is a miracle. And so we must retrain our hearts to recognize these moments for what they are. The helping hand of God is not always wrapped in thunder. Sometimes it is in the way your spirit calms for no reason. Sometimes it is in the person who says just the words you needed to hear without knowing your situation. Sometimes it is in the doors that close, not because you're being punished, but because you are being protected from something you cannot yet understand. When we expect help only in grand forms, we risk missing the quiet wonders happening all around us. The angels of God are not always like the ones in paintings with shining robes and outstretched wings. Sometimes they appear in disguise, in the form of ordinary people doing ordinary things at exactly the right moment. Sometimes they don't appear at all, at least not to our eyes, but they are there nonetheless, guiding, guarding, and gently influencing what we do not see. It is humbling to think that so much of our lives are touched by hands we cannot name, shaped by wisdom we cannot trace. But that is the nature of divine subtlety. It does not shout, it does not parade. It simply helps quietly, steadily, faithfully. And in that quietness, God is inviting us to trust Him, not because He's made a spectacle, but because He has made a promise that we are not alone, that we are watched over, that we are helped. And that even when we cannot see the help, we are still being held. One of the most remarkable things about angels is not simply their strength or their presence, but their quiet, unwavering obedience. They do not ask to be seen, they do not demand thanks, and they do not seek to be admired. They carry out their tasks with perfect devotion, not because they are forced to, but because they desire to. Their service flows out of loyalty to the one who made them, and their actions are guided by a purpose greater than recognition. In a world so obsessed with being noticed, this is a truth that feels both foreign and deeply refreshing. Angels do not work for applause. They do not need their names printed in books or their images carved into stone. They do not linger for compliments after their work is done. In fact, their greatest strength may not be their power at all, but their humility. They are content to be forgotten by us, as long as they are faithful to Him. What drives them is not attention but alignment. They are perfectly in step with the will of God, and that is enough for them. This kind of obedience is rare in human experience. We often do good because we want it to be seen. Even when our motives are sincere, there is often a small part of us that hopes someone will notice, someone will appreciate what we've done. We long to be affirmed, to be validated. Angels, by contrast, are free from this hunger. Their identity is not built on how others see them. It is rooted entirely in the joy of serving their Creator. It's worth noting that angels have seen the splendor of heaven. They have stood in the presence of God's glory. They have witnessed wonders far beyond anything we could imagine, and still they stoop low to help human beings who often don't even know they're there. They do not see such tasks as beneath them. They do not consider watchfulness or protection to be a lesser assignment. To them, obedience is never a small thing. Whether they are delivering a message, guarding a soul, or fighting unseen battles, they do it all with the same wholehearted devotion. There is something deeply beautiful about this willingness to work without recognition. It echoes the nature of love itself, which does not boast, does not seek its own glory, but gives freely. Angels reflect that love. They reflect the humility of heaven, where greatness is measured not by status, but by service. Their obedience is not mechanical, like that of a machine following orders. It is alive, intentional, and joyful. It comes from a place of trust and reverence, not mere duty. And in their obedience, they teach us something important. They remind us that faithfulness does not always look impressive. Sometimes it means doing the right thing when no one is watching. Sometimes it means saying yes to something small, over and over again. Sometimes it means protecting, praying, staying near, without ever being thanked. That kind of faithfulness is rare, but it is holy. And angels live in that holiness constantly. It also speaks to a deeper spiritual truth, that the kingdom of God does not operate by the rules of this world. Here, we celebrate achievement, status, visibility. But in God's kingdom, the hidden things often carry the most weight. The servant is honored, the last is made first, the unnoticed is remembered. The angels understand this perfectly because they live it out in every act of silent service. They are not interested in being the center of the story. They are content to serve the author. Even when they intervene in our lives, rescuing, guiding, protecting, they do so with quiet hands. They do not appear to take credit or demand gratitude. They move on, leaving behind only the trace of peace, a course corrected, a heart strengthened, and even then we often miss it. But they do not mind. Their joy does not depend on our awareness. It comes from the smile of the one who sent them. Perhaps then it is not just what angels do that matters. Perhaps it is how they do it, with humility, with silence, with obedience that seeks no reward. And maybe, in watching them, we are invited to do the same, to live in such a way that our good works don't point to us, but through us, to the one who called us, who sees every quiet act, and who values faithfulness far more than fame. It is one of the deepest questions we ask in moments of pain. If God is with me, why am I still suffering? It's a question that echoes in hospital rooms, behind closed doors, in the silence after heartbreak, and in the confusion of prayers that seem to go unanswered. We imagine, sometimes without meaning to, that divine presence should mean the absence of pain. That protection must always look like comfort. That help should always come quickly and clearly. But the truth woven into both scripture and experience is that even in the midst of suffering, we are not abandoned. And even when we do not see the help, it does not mean help is absent. Angels do not only appear in peaceful places. They are not reserved for sunlit days and moments of praise. Often they are closest when the sky grows dark and the way forward is uncertain. Their presence does not always remove the pain, but they stand with us in it. They do not always lift us out of the fire, but they walk into it with us, like the fourth figure in the furnace beside Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are not there to shield us from all sorrow, but to ensure we are not alone within it. There is a kind of protection that is not about prevention, but about preservation. It is the difference between being untouched by difficulty and being unbroken by it. We may still pass through the valley, but we are held as we walk. We may still feel the sting of loss, the ache of grief, the weight of unanswered questions, but even then we are not unguarded. The angels of God are sent not just to change outcomes, but to carry burdens, to strengthen resolve, to whisper courage into a soul that feels it cannot go on. We sometimes think that when we are in pain, heaven has turned its face away, but pain is not proof of absence. In fact, it may be that in the hidden world beyond our eyes, the spiritual realm is more alive and active than ever. What if in our darkest hour we are most surrounded by divine attention? What if the very battle we are fighting is evidence not of abandonment, but of importance? What if the storm around us draws the guardians closer, not farther? To suffer is not to be forgotten. The cross itself, the very heart of Christian faith, is proof of this. God did not spare his own son from suffering, yet he never left him, and he does not leave us. The angels did not swoop in to stop the crucifixion, but they were there before, strengthening Jesus in Gethsemane. They were thereafter declaring his resurrection. They did not always remove the suffering, but they were never far from the story. And they are never far from yours. We may not feel the nearness of God or his angels when we are overwhelmed. Pain has a way of blinding us to the invisible. But just because we cannot feel something doesn't mean it is not real. Feelings are not always faithful guides. And often, the deepest work God does in us happens not in the absence of struggle, but right in the center of it. There is a kind of growth that only comes through sorrow, a kind of clarity that only comes through tears. And sometimes the angels are not there to stop the process, but to help us endure it. This is not easy. It is not always comforting in the moment. But it is true, and truth, even when it is hard, is still a gift. If you are suffering, it does not mean you are less loved. If you are in pain, it does not mean you are less protected. God's care is not withdrawn from those who hurt. It is drawn even closer, and his angels are often nearest when we are most in need, even if we cannot see them. So we press on not because the road is easy, but because we are not walking it alone. There are unseen hands lifting us, unseen voices praying over us, unseen warriors surrounding us. And even in the moments we feel most forgotten, we are remembered. Even in silence, we are seen. And even in suffering, we are not abandoned. Faith at its heart is a kind of seeing, not with the eyes in our head, but with the eyes of the soul. It is the decision to trust in what we cannot prove, to lean into what we cannot fully explain. It asks us to believe that there is more going on than what we can measure or control. And in a world that glorifies the visible, the tangible, and the immediate, that kind of belief often feels fragile, even foolish. But faith is not about being naive. It is about standing firm when the evidence around you tells only part of the story. The unseen is not the unreal. Gravity cannot be seen, and yet we trust it every time we walk. Wind cannot be held, and yet we feel its presence in every rustling leaf. Love cannot be weighed, yet it moves people to do impossible things. In the same way, the spiritual realm, the workings of God, the quiet movements of His angels, these may not be visible to the eye, but they are no less real. Faith is what allows us to live in light of that reality, even when everything else urges us to doubt. We are not meant to understand everything. That is not a flaw, it is part of our design. We are creatures who long, who wonder, who reach beyond what we can see. And in that reaching, faith is born. It is not always loud. It often grows in silence, in waiting, in the tension between hope and uncertainty. Faith does not eliminate doubt. It teaches us how to carry it. It does not erase fear. It reminds us that fear does not have the final word. When it comes to the work of angels, we are often asked to believe without seeing. They move through the shadows of our lives, deflecting danger, delivering comfort, guiding choices, and most of the time, we do not even know they were there. That can be unsettling if we believe that seeing is the only path to certainty. But faith gives us another way. It whispers, even if you didn't notice, you were still protected. Even if you didn't feel it, you were still guided. It teaches us that trust does not always need confirmation. Sometimes it simply rests quiet and sure in the character of God. There's a deep peace that comes when we accept that we are not in charge of everything, that we do not need to see every step ahead before we walk, that we do not need to feel every presence to know we are surrounded. Faith opens the door to humility, and with it, to wonder. It lets us breathe in mystery without fear. It lets us move through life with the quiet confidence that we are never alone, even if we never hear the footsteps beside us. This kind of trust does not come all at once. It grows slowly, often through trials. It deepens in the waiting seasons, in the days when answers don't come quickly. But with time, faith becomes less about what we feel in the moment and more about what we know to be true, even when our emotions waver. And what is true is this: we are watched over, we are loved, we are helped, often in ways too quiet for words. Some of the greatest acts of God in your life may never be revealed to you this side of eternity. You may never know the dangers you narrowly missed, the paths you were quietly nudged away from, the grief that brushed past you and never landed. And yet every moment of your life is marked by the mercy of a God who sends His angels to walk with you. Not to impress you, but to protect you. Not to be seen, but to serve. Faith is what allows us to live with that kind of unseen assurance. It does not promise that life will be without struggle, but it promises that we are never abandoned in it. It reminds us that just because God is quiet doesn't mean He is absent. And just because the angels are invisible doesn't mean they are inactive. So we keep walking, eyes open to the seen, hearts open to the unseen. We move forward not because we see the whole picture, but because we trust the one who does. And in that trust, we find peace, not the peace that comes from having every answer, but the deeper peace of knowing that, even in mystery, we are held.